So I've got my case here. I need to move my lever to the blade's open end of the scale, and of course I don't have the scale on there to remind me which way I'm supposed to be moving it. Let's have a look to this end. Okay, so that's at the fully open position there. I've got two screw holes here and here, and one over there. They match up with the holes in the case. That's the right way round. Looking to see where that hole is. It's by that one. So that goes right there. I've got to get that over those pins, wriggle it about to get them all seated, flip my jig over, lift the outside off, pop it underneath, make sure I've got my holes aligned in the case. There are 3 small screws that hold that fixed plate to the case. So I'll get the first one in, just run that in very lightly. Line that hole up. Get that screw in. It doesn't want to start. That's better. Get the third one in. And I haven't done any of these screws up tight. Just run it down lightly. Take the jig off. Now I'm checking here to make sure that the pivots are all correctly positioned in that plate. They look okay. Now if I move the lever, the setting lever here, I'm watching to see if all the blades are moving. I've got a circular opening and it's all moving smoothly. That tells me that's all okay. I can tighten up my 3 screws. That screw head's a bit damaged. Check that this all moves smoothly. It does. There's a bit of controlled friction in it. That's fine. It doesn't need to be loose. It needs to move smoothly, and I'm not seeing any distortion in the blades. I know the blades are clean, so they shouldn't cause me any problem. So there's my shutter case dealt with. The diaphragm is done, and I can turn my attention to the mechanism plate. Now the mechanism plate, we've obviously got our 5 shutter blades here. They're all just sitting in place. I'll tip those out. Well, I would have tipped them out, but as you can see, they didn't tip out. They're glued in place with oil, so the blades are stuck together. So those are very oily looking blades. I'll certainly have to clean them. And the mechanism plate. We can unhook the spring here from the lever that swings the blade actuating ring. Remove the screw that holds it in position. That was very tight. Take the lever off. That's reluctant to move. And at the base we have 3 screws hold the retainer plate in place. They're probably not all the same length. They might be. Looks like they are today. Often they're not all the same length. So get 3 short screws. Take the plate off, and here's the blade actuating ring that swings backwards, oscillates backwards and forwards to swing the blades out and back in again. And the mechanism plate, all we've got left on here to deal with is the retard gear train. You can see that moves. It's a bit oh, it's not sticky, it's a bit sluggish in its action. I'll need to flush all this with naphtha and wipe down all of this plate with naphtha to get it all clean. I don't advise removing this speed train from the plate to clean it separately, because it's a bugger getting the adjustments back together again. If you do that, it's just not worth the strife. Sometimes you have to. Sometimes there'll be a fault there that you can only deal with by taking that off. But generally speaking, particularly if the train works, I'm holding back the pallets at this end of my finger and swinging the setting lever backwards and forwards. That moves quite freely anyway. All it needs to be is cleaned a bit, so that I'll have to deal with, and I'll do that by starting with some naphtha on a cotton bud, and I'll clean the housing. Be careful of the spring here, it's easily damaged if you catch something on it. What I need to do is just remove all this filth that's here. It's all old grease. It's long since stopped doing anything useful in the way of lubrication. Now it's just a handy binder to hold dust and grime and so forth in place. Just acts like a grinding paste more than a lubricant. So I want all of this clean, and when I put it back together I'll be using molybdenum paste to lubricate some things, and other components I may lubricate with graphite powder. The speed train in particular, that's a useful thing to do. Now there's a hairspring here on the retard gear train that winds up as the train as the lever's pulled across. If you release the pallets at that end, it'll hold it pulled back like that, so the hairspring's out of the way, and then you can run your cleaning tip down the inside without hitting that spring. You don't want to damage that spring. It's exceptionally difficult to try and sort that out if you make a mess of it. So in this channel, that's where the blade actuating ring will run. That needs to be clean. You don't want anything sticky going on in there. So some naphtha. I'll just pour some naphtha on their speed train typically. Work it backwards and forwards. Rinse and repeat. And that'll just loosen up any contaminants that are there. Then typically I'll just take the blower, blow all that naphtha out. And as you blow it out, you're also blowing out anything else that might have picked up. Old oil, dust, anything of that nature is gone. So now you see that this is freer in its action, much smoother in its action. That's simply because we've removed all the contaminants from it. It's all nice and clean in there. That's all it required really. You don't need to do a hell of a lot of work typically to make that work well. But that was all that really needed. Looking at the marks here, now almost certainly these holes I'm seeing here are where that flash arrangement was screwed into the side of the case, which tells me that they didn't do any of that preparation prior or with the shutter apart. The shutter was already assembled when they added that flash mechanism, and I mean it means that they drilled those holes while the shutter was still assembled, so all the filth and the rubbish from that machining operations all just went straight into the shutter. So it's a wonder it worked as well as it did. The blade actuating ring I'm just cleaning here with some naphtha. This looks quite clean as these things go. And the retainer plate. That's a bit grimier. This is the face that faces the shutter blades. It's got the pivot points on it for the blades. This surface should be nice and clean and free from any oil. You can see that there's a bit of staining and marks on there. That's corrosion. This is a fingerprint. Means somebody's grabbed it between finger and thumb. It's worth avoiding things like that. Put the blade actuating ring in place. It only goes on in one position. There's a little pin here that's picked up by that lever I showed you earlier. And this plate only goes on in one position likewise, which is there. It's got a little rivet that locates it. A tiny dowel. And these 3 screws in. As usual, just do them up very lightly indeed until they're all in place. Once they're all in place, you can go back and tighten them up if there are no problems. Just check that the ring moves smoothly, and it does. Tighten the 3 screws down. If those screws are loose, they can catch the shutter blades as the shutter blades swing open, and they can stop the shutter from working. It can be very hard fault to diagnose from outside the shutter, because you can't see any of it happening. It's all happening right deep on the inside. Anyway, so that looks good. Now the lever that swings that, I'll just clean that because that looks a bit grimy. And the screw likewise might have some sticky stuff underneath the head where it holds the lever down. Just making sure that's clean. That looks good. I usually take some molybdenum paste, just run it through the pivot point and through the little slot there where it couples to the pin on the blade actuating ring. Then this can go back in place. Run the single screw back in. Check that that action's smooth and free. That's good. And put its spring back in place. That should be nice and snappy in its action now. That's good. That spring acts to return the blades to the closed position. You can think of it as the return spring or the detent. That's fine. I'm going to lubricate this mechanism plate now with a bit of graphite powder. I want to use it to lubricate the retard gear train. Basically it'll just lubricate the surfaces of those teeth where they mesh with each other, just make it run a bit smoother and less sticky. And it'll also run some in here, and that will lubricate that blade actuating ring slightly. It needs very little. You could alternatively lubricate that blade actuating ring with a very fine smear of molybdenum paste. Works well. You need hardly any at all. You certainly don't want to get too much on there, because you just end up with a sticky spot for all practical purposes. Okay, well that looks good. Some graphite powder next, I think. Right, I'll just apply a little bit of graphite powder here, which I've got loose in this container at the moment. Just drop it in the back. I just want to work that into the blade actuating ring and the case at the back of the mechanism plate, and I'll blow that out shortly, and I'll do the same for the retard gear train. Just sprinkle a bit of graphite powder on the gears there, hold back the pallet wheel, pallet lever, and just move that movement backwards and forwards to distribute that powder. And that's all I need to do. And all I'll do now is I'll go and blow that out, get rid of all the loose graphite powder, and then I can put the cleaned shutter blades in place, which I've also cleaned while you weren't watching. I'll just unhook that spring from the lever, swing that into the blade's open position, and start putting my shutter blades in place. Which way are we going? This way. Start right here. The blades I just cleaned with some naphtha in exactly the same way I cleaned the diaphragm blades. If the shutter blades show significant marks or any surface corrosion, you can clean them with some metal polish. I typically use Brasso, but there was no serious problem with the hair, so I didn't need to bother with that. Right, the blades are all in position. Now I can put the case on. So the case only goes on in one position. There are 3 screws here. They are not equidistant. So it's just a case of figuring out where they line up the holes on the case, which is right about there. Make sure those holes line up. And there should be 3 case screws here. They were neatly sitting in a container, but I've knocked that over, so they're scattered all over the tabletop now. There's 2 of them. I'll find the 3rd one in a second. Run those screws down very lightly indeed, in case you've managed to disturb a shutter blade while you're putting the case over the top. You do not want to get a shutter blade trapped between the case and some other point and cause problems. I'm checking that the blades open and close smoothly, and they do. I can hook that spring back in place, flip it back over, do those screws up slightly, and I'll find my last shutter case screw. I can see it over there, and I'll put that in and then continue putting the rest of the shutter together. Right, to start with the shutter, first I'll start with the B lever, which sits right in here, so we get its spring positioned correctly. That's held in place with a little shoulder screw. Make sure that's moving freely. That looks good. Our shutter release lever. I'll just put a tiny touch of molybdenum paste in these surfaces. Whoops, it's just lost its spring. I'll just pop that in place. I want to work out which way around this spring goes, because that spring operates this lever. Let's just get this lever in position. That lever looks a little bit stiff. Oh no, it's okay. This is sometimes awkward to get in place because you've got to get that post down into the hole in the plate, and the plate is, the hole's right on the edge of a notch. That's that screw. That's good. Just looking at the state of that lever and making sure it's not bent. This lever goes on there, so that spring must go on that way. That spring needs to go under there. I wonder if I put that the other way it would fit better. This is a bit an unusual arrangement. Deckel used half a dozen different arrangements for their springs at various times. Yeah, that seems to work. Okay, the 500th of a second spring, the high speed spring for the shutter. This just adds a bit of extra spring tension when the shutter's set to the highest speed. That positioned correctly. This lever serves a couple of purposes in most of these shutters. It's just really acting as a return spring for the shutter release lever more than anything else. Let's put a little touch of molybdenum on the end of it. Get that in underneath that spring. It's one of these jobs you only need 3 hands. That fits into that lever there, so that our shutter release lever is now spring loaded. This piece here, which would be the cable release socket in many cases, and it's not in this shutter, it's just a guide for that arm. It's also the spot where the flash sink fits in later shutters, where it sometimes fits in converted shutters. That's all good. what do I need here now? Not an awful lot really. Got my main lever, as this piece is called, with this damaged spring. So I've got to find another spring for my main lever. There's always a struggle getting the spring on, trying to get it in the correct orientation so that it'll fit in the case and run smoothly. I've got to go and sort through my shutter parts.